The colder the lake got, the less likely it was that anyone would find their way to the end of the road, and that was exactly how Sergeant Mireille Okafor wanted it. The last turn off Highway 17 wasn't marked. The gravel track wound 3 kilometers through black spruce and muskeg before it dead-ended at a frozen dock and a cabin that had belonged to her grandfather, and before him to nobody at all. The nearest town, a cluster of gas stations and a Tim Hortons called Hearst, was 40 minutes south. The nearest person who knew she was here was roughly the same distance, and she intended to keep it that way. She had been up since 4, not because anything woke her. Sleep just stopped, the way it always did, somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, and no amount of lying still in the dark made it come back. So she built the fire, put the kettle on, and stood at the window, watching frost thicken on the glass, while Kodiak moved in slow circles behind her, his nails clicking on the pine floor. He wasn't her dog. That was the thing people didn't understand when they saw them together. He had been her partner's, Warrant Officer Joel Fairbanks, K-9 handler, 8 years with the Canadian Special Operations Regiment, killed on a training exercise outside Petawawa 11 months ago by a chain of decisions Mireille had set in motion and could not take back. Kodiak was a Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, black-masked, and built like something that had been compressed under pressure. He had come home from Petawawa in a crate, while Joel came home in a flag-draped box, and for reasons Mireille had never been able to fully explain to the welfare officer who'd processed the transfer, she had taken the dog. She told herself it was practical. She was a handler. She understood working dogs. She couldn't bear the thought of him going to someone who didn't. That was the version she told other people. The real version was harder to look at. The ice on Lake Nagagami had gone in hard that year. By the second week of December, it was already 30 centimeters thick, and she'd taken to walking it in the early mornings with Kodiak running ahead, nose working the wind, body low and efficient the way working dogs always moved. He never strayed far. He checked back every few minutes, circling, orienting on her, and she let herself believe. Some mornings, the bad ones, that he was checking on her rather than simply running the pattern Joel had trained into him. She had put in for extended leave, citing psychological grounds. She had meant it as a bureaucratic maneuver, a way to buy time before she had to go back and face the unit and the review board and the 47 people who had watched her give an order she should not have given. The leave had been approved quickly, which told her everything she needed to know about how the CSOR brass felt about having her in the building right now. That was fine. She didn't want to be in any building. She wanted the lake and the cold and the silence, and she had all three. What she hadn't counted on was getting sick. It started as a scratch at the back of her throat sometime around Christmas, which she spent alone with a bottle of Quebec cider and a crossword puzzle she didn't finish. She put it down to dry air. The wood stove pulled hard and the cabin held heat badly, and she'd been breathing smoke-tinged warmth for 3 weeks. She drank tea. She ignored it. By New Year's Eve, it had moved into her chest, a tightness she noticed on the lake walk when she had to stop and press her palm flat against her sternum and breathe through it. Still, she didn't think much of it. She'd had pneumonia before, once in training, once in a tent outside Kandahar, and she recognized it as something the body worked through. She wasn't going to a doctor. She had decided this without quite deciding it. The nearest clinic was in Hearst. She didn't want to drive 40 minutes in -30 to sit in a waiting room full of people and explain why she was living alone at the end of a logging road. She heated soup and took the ibuprofen she had in the first aid kit and told herself she was fine. She said it out loud sometimes to the cabin. "I'm fine." Kodiak would look up from whatever corner he'd claimed that hour and hold her gaze for a moment, and then look away, which she chose to interpret as agreement. She was not fine. The fever came on January 3rd. She knew it was high because she could feel it in the soles of her feet, a particular kind of radiant wrongness that she associated with the body no longer pretending. She checked herself with the thermometer in the kit, 39.4. Then, 2 hours later, 39.9. She thought about the satellite phone. She had one, a Garmin InReach, in the bag by the door. She hadn't turned it on in 3 weeks. She told herself that was because she needed the silence, not because she was afraid of who might call, or what they might say, or what she might have to answer for. She put more wood on the fire, and lay down on the cot with her coat over her, and fell asleep without meaning to. When she woke up, she was shaking so hard her teeth were clicking together, and the fire had gone out, and Kodiak was pressed against the full length of her, every pound of him, radiating heat into her side like he was made for it. She lay still and tried to take stock. She was cold. She was confused in a way that took several seconds to orient out of. She had to actively remember where she was, piece it together: cabin, lake, Nagagami, January. She had a headache that sat behind her eyes like something with weight. When she tried to sit up, the room did something wrong. Not spinning, exactly. More like it folded briefly and then corrected. "Okay," she said. Kodiak lifted his head and looked at her. "Okay," she said again, to both of them. She made herself get up and get the fire going before she did anything else, because if she passed out on the floor, she needed the cabin to be warm. Her hands shook on the matches. She burned 2 before she got the kindling. She stood there until she was sure the fire had caught, and then she got the satellite phone out of the bag. 40.6 degrees, she checked again. Still 40.6. She had been trained in field medicine. She knew what sepsis looked like in the abstract. The progression, the window, the mortality rate if you waited too long. She knew it in a general, clinical way that was almost entirely useless, now that she was the person shaking in front of the fire at the end of a logging road in northern Ontario. She called 911 on the InReach. The dispatcher was calm and competent and had clearly dealt with remote medical calls before. She walked Mireille through her location, her symptoms, her temperature. She asked about the road. 3 kilometers off 17, Mireille said. Gravel. Passable with 4-wheel drive. The track is narrow. We're going to send an ambulance from Hearst and the volunteer fire department from Yogs. They may need to transfer you partway. Is there anyone with you? No, there's a dog. There was a brief pause. Belgian Malinois. Working dog. Former military. Another pause. Shorter this time. Is he aggressive? Mireille looked at Kodiak. He was sitting directly in front of her, watching her with the particular focused attention of a dog that knew the situation had changed. He's protective, she said, which was more precise than aggressive and also more honest. We'll make note of that for the crew. She stayed on the line. The dispatcher kept her talking, asked her name again, her date of birth, whether she had any allergies. She answered. At some point, she became aware that she had sat down on the floor without deciding to, her back against the cot, and Kodiak had moved to stand beside her rather than sit. His body was between her and the door. She thought, "That's what you trained for, Joel. That's what you made him into." She didn't say it out loud. The fire department truck came first, lights cutting through the spruce before she could hear the engine. Then the ambulance. She heard them stop at the end of the gravel track. The logging road was too narrow for the ambulance to navigate at night, and then she heard boots on the ice outside and a knock at the door that she didn't have the energy to shout a response to. Kodiak moved. He didn't bark. That was the thing. He didn't bark or growl. He simply crossed to the door in 3 strides and stood in front of it, and the sound he made was low and sustained and entirely without ambiguity. The knock came again. Paramedic services. We're here for Sergeant Okafor. Can we come in? She tried to push herself up. The room did the folding thing again. You're going to have to talk to him, she said, loud enough that they could hear her through the door. His name is Kodiak. Don't reach for the handle. Just talk to him. Silence. Then she heard a voice she hadn't heard before. Not the first responder's voice, not the dispatcher's voice. Lower. A woman's voice, something careful in the cadence of it. Kodiak. Just the name. said the way Joel used to say it, not a command, not a greeting, just an acknowledgement. I know who you are. The sound from Kodiak stopped. Mireille heard it go quiet, and then heard him move, not toward the door but backward, clearing it, and she understood without seeing it that he had stepped aside. The door opened. The paramedic who came through first was a young man with a red jacket and an equipment bag who immediately crouched down to Mireille's level with a practiced ease. Behind him came a woman in the same red jacket, late 20s or early 30s, brown hair pulled back, eyes that moved around the room with a competence that was almost military in its thoroughness. Kodiak stood 3 feet from the door and watched. I'm Paramedic Renaud, the young man said. This is my partner, Paramedic Solange Fairbanks. We're going to get you stabilized. Can you tell me where your pain is worst? Mireille registered the name. Fairbanks. She looked past him at the woman. Solange Fairbanks was already setting down her bag. She was checking the temperature by the fire, the state of the wood stove, the first aid kit on the floor. When she looked up and found Mireille looking at her, she didn't look away. Let us work, Solange said. Her voice was steady. We can talk later. They worked efficiently. IV line, oxygen sat monitor, blood pressure cuff. Her stats were not good. The young man, Paramedic Renaud, had a way of presenting numbers neutrally that didn't fully disguise their weight. She was dehydrated, febrile, BP lower than it should be. They started a saline drip and called the Hearst Hospital to give a heads up. Throughout all of it, Kodiak sat in the corner of the cabin by the wood pile, watching Solange Fairbanks with an attention that he was not paying to anything else in the room. Mireille watched him watch her. Working dogs didn't do that to strangers. They didn't relax into vigilance around someone they'd never met. They didn't grant the particular quality of attention that meant I have categorized you as known. Fairbanks, Mireille said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, dried out and wrong. That's an unusual name. Solange was checking the IV line. She didn't pause. It is. My partner's name was Fairbanks, Joel Fairbanks. Solange went still. Not a flinch, not a reaction she lost control of. Just a stillness, brief and contained, the way someone who has had a very long time to prepare for something goes still when the moment finally arrives. I know, she said. They got Mireille onto the stretcher. The fire department volunteers carried it out to the truck because the ambulance couldn't come closer. The night was 40 below with the wind, and she could feel it trying to get through the blankets they'd wrapped her in. Above her, the spruce trees were black against a sky that was absolutely clear and full of stars, the kind of sky you only got far enough from any city, and she looked up at it and thought absurdly, Joel would have liked this. She heard Kodiak behind her. She turned her head and saw him trotting alongside the stretcher, close to the volunteer on her left, not interfering, just present. Solange Fairbanks was walking on the other side, one hand on the IV bag, eyes checking the trail for ice. He's going to try to get in the ambulance, Mireille said. I know, Solange said. They'll try to stop him. They won't be able to. A small pause. I'll ride with him. The Hearst Hospital was 60 beds and a trauma bay and an emergency physician named Dr. O.C. who had the focused energy of someone who had been doing remote emergency medicine for 20 years and had stopped being surprised by anything. He took one look at Mireille's vitals and immediately shifted into a gear she recognized. Not panic, but priority. They did not let Kodiak past the sliding doors. This was not a negotiation. The triage nurse cited policy in a tone that was sympathetic but immovable, and Mireille was too compromised to do anything about it, except say from the stretcher he won't leave. Which was not a complaint, it was just a fact. She was right. By the time they had her in a bay and connected to the hospital monitors, she could hear him in the corridor. Not barking, just the clicking of his nails, back and forth, the particular pacing that meant he was monitoring a perimeter he could not secure. A nurse named Constable, which was not a name, it was someone's idea of a joke, or maybe not, came to the bay with a clipboard and a look of careful neutrality. There's a dog in our corridor, she said. "He won't bite anyone who doesn't threaten me," Mireille said. "Can you tell the staff? Is there someone who can take him?" Mireille didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the ceiling, calculating something. Her head still hurt. Her thoughts moved slowly, like they were coming through water. "The paramedic," she said. "Solange. She can settle him." Constable went away. 5 minutes later, through the curtain, Mireille heard the pacing stop. The IV antibiotics went in, and the fever started coming down over the next few hours, in the slow, unconvincing way that fevers came down when they'd had time to establish themselves. Dr. Osi came and went. Mireille slept in pieces. 20 minutes here, 40 minutes there, each time resurfacing to the sound of the hospital and the particular antiseptic cold of a room being kept at climate-controlled warmth. It was 3 in the morning when Solange came in. She came quietly, the way you entered a room where someone was possibly asleep. She sat in the chair by the IV pole without turning on any additional light. Kodiak was with her. He came directly to Mireille's side and put his chin on the edge of the mattress, and she put her hand on his head without thinking, the way she always did. He was warm from wherever he'd been with Solange. "He let you stay with him," Mireille said. "He did." Solange was watching Kodiak, not Mireille. "He knows who I am. How long have you known since you called?" "The dispatcher ran your name. I was doing a shift review when it came over. The moment I heard Sergeant Okafor and K9 and Petawawa, I asked to take the call. She said it without defensiveness, without apology. Just the facts of a decision she'd made. I could have disclosed earlier. I almost did in the cabin. But I thought, you needed medical, not conversation." Mireille looked at the ceiling. "You're Joel's sister," she said. "His younger sister. He talked about you." Another pause. A lot. It was a hard thing to hear. It was the kind of thing that went in differently at 3 in the morning, with antibiotics in your blood and a month of living alone behind you, and Mireille let it sit there for a moment without trying to move around it. "I need to tell you what happened," she said. "You don't—" "I do." Solange looked at her then. In the low light from the corridor, her face was hard to read, but her eyes were steady. She didn't argue further. The exercise was low risk on paper, Mireille said. Breach and clear on a decommissioned building outside Petawawa. Kodiak was point, Joel was handler, I was team lead. She spoke slowly, pacing herself because her thoughts still moved through water. There was a structural problem with the second floor. The engineering assessment was dated. I should have flagged it. I didn't flag it. I cleared the building for entry based on a document that was 3 years old, and the second floor gave way when Joel took the far corner. And she stopped. She breathed. He was gone before the dust settled, she said. Kodiak got out. He came back to the collapse site and wouldn't leave it, and they had to sedate him to move him. That's the versions the board has. That's what happened. Solange was quiet. I've been over it every day since, Mireille said. Every single day. What I should have said. What I should have checked. There's no version of it where I made the right call. No, Solange agreed. There probably isn't. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 11 months. Everyone else, the welfare officer, the chaplain, the psychologist she'd seen twice before she stopped going, everyone else had moved quickly toward words like reasonable and limited information and no guarantee. They meant well. She understood that. But there was a quality to being told it was reasonable that felt like being told the wrong thing in the right voice. He used to say, Solange began, and then stopped. She started again. He used to say that the things that mattered in the field weren't talent or training. He said they were the people beside you. He talked about you like that, like you were the person beside him. She looked down at Kodiak. He trusted you. That makes it worse, Mireille said. I know it does. Solange reached down and put her hand next to Mireille's on Kodiak's head. It should, for a while, but not forever. They kept Mireille in Hurst for 4 days. Her fever broke at the end of the 2nd day, and her blood pressure came back up by the 3rd doctor. Osi was cautious and methodical, and made her walk the hallway twice a day until she could do it without her heart rate spiking. And she did it without complaining, because it seemed like the least she could do. Kodiak stayed. This was not officially approved, but after the first night nobody challenged it directly. He slept under Mireille's bed and was invisible enough to the night staff that a quiet collective decision was made to overlook his presence. The day nurses brought him water in a stainless steel bowl they'd found somewhere, and he accepted it with the dignified indifference of a dog who had never questioned his welcome. Solange came back on her next shift, and the one after that. She was not always Mireille's assigned paramedic. Her calls came and went, but she came during the quiet hours and sat in the chair and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. They talked about Joel the way you talked about someone when you were both still figuring out how to hold them in pieces. The good things first, the funny things, and then later the harder ones. She told Mireille that Joel had wanted to be a paramedic himself when he was young, that he'd shifted to the military at 18 because it had seemed like the faster route to what he was chasing. Not action, not the things civilians imagined when they imagined it, but the specific feeling of being useful when it counted. He found that in Kodiak, Solange said. Handling. He said it was the clearest work he'd ever done. Mireille looked at Kodiak. He was lying across her feet, a solid, familiar weight. He was very good at it, she said. It wasn't enough, but it was true, and true was what she had. On the fourth day, the morning before discharge, Solange came in early. She wasn't in her paramedic jacket. She was in a grey sweater and jeans, off shift, hair down, and it was the first time Mireille had seen her look like anything other than a professional performing a function. She had a paper bag with her, bagels and cream cheese from the Tim Hortons on the highway, still warm. They sat at the small table by the window, Mireille in the hospital gown, Solange across from her, Kodiak under the table between them, and they ate bagels in a grey January morning light while the lake road sat 40 minutes away and the cabin waited. "You should come back," Solange said. "To the cabin. To the unit. Eventually." She watched Mireille. "Not because you owe them. Because it's what you are." "I don't know what I am anymore," Mireille said. It came out flatter than she intended. Not self-pity, just the plain statement of a fact she'd been living with. "I know." Solange broke off a piece of bagel and held it under the table without looking down. Kodiak took it with an offhand delicacy that suggested this was not the first time this had happened between them. "But you came out of that cabin. You called. That matters. I called because my temperature was 40.6. You called," Solange said again, like the reasons were beside the point. "You let people in." The discharge paperwork took most of the morning. Doctor. OC went through the medications. Oral antibiotics, 2 weeks, no exceptions. And the warning signs and the follow-up care, and Mireille listened and answered his questions and signed what needed signing. He shook her hand before she left, a firm, brief grip. "The dog can come back any time," he said, which Mireille understood as the closest thing to a compliment he was likely to offer. Solange drove her back. She had a truck, a blue Silverado with a cracked rear bumper and a set of snowshoes in the bed, and she drove the way she did everything. Capable and unhurried, comfortable with silence. Kodiak rode in the back seat and put his nose out the window crack the whole way, reading whatever the January air had to say. At the turnoff to the logging road, Solange slowed. "I'll come back to check on you," she said. "In a week, if that's all right." Mireille looked at the narrow track disappearing into the black spruce. From here you couldn't see the cabin, couldn't see the lake. It looked like nothing, a road to nowhere. "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't have to." Mireille turned and looked at her. Solange was watching the road. Her hands were easy on the wheel. She had the same quality Kodiak had, the quality of something that had already decided and was simply waiting for everything else to catch up. "Okay," Mireille said. Solange nodded once, pulled forward. Took the turn slowly on the gravel. The spruce closed in on either side, and the road narrowed, and the lake appeared ahead, white and still under the pewter sky. The cabin looked the same as it always did, small, grey, stubborn against the cold. Kodiak scrambled over the seat without asking permission and pressed his nose against the windshield as they approached tail-going, and Mireille watched him and felt something shift in her chest. Not heal, not that clean or quick, but shift, the way ice shifted in early spring. Not breaking, just moving. They stopped at the dock. She got out first, and Kodiak jumped after her, and the snow took their weight, the clean, familiar crunch of packed January. She stood and breathed the cold in and looked at the lake. All that flat white stretching north into nothing, the tree line a dark border around it, the sky above completely cloudless. She heard Solange's door, heard her boots on the snow. "It's a good place," Solange said from somewhere behind her. "It was my grandfather's," Mireille said. "He knew what he was doing." Kodiak was already at the cabin door, looking back at them both with the focused expectation of a dog who understood that doors opened from the inside, and that one of them had the key. Mireille found it in her coat pocket, walked to the door, and put it in the lock. She held the door open. Kodiak went in first, already moving to his corner by the woodpile, already home. Solange came after, ducking slightly under the low frame, pulling off her gloves. Mireille looked at the cold grate. "I'll get the fire," she said. She knelt in front of the stove and built it the way her grandfather had shown her, kindling first, small pieces laid in a pattern that caught fast and didn't collapse. She struck the match on the second try. She held it to the paper and watched the flame take. The fire built slowly, then with more confidence, and the heat began to push back against the cold in the cabin. And behind her she heard the quiet sounds of Solange unpacking the bag, the bagels they hadn't finished, a thermos of coffee she'd apparently brought without mentioning, and the particular click of Kodiak settling himself with the weight and authority of a dog who knew he was not going anywhere. She sat with her back to the fire and let it warm her. It was January in northern Ontario, and the road was long, and she had not fixed anything. She knew that. The board review was still waiting. The unit was still waiting. The version of herself that could go back to that world was still somewhere ahead of her, unresolved, unclear. But the fire was going. Kodiak was home. And someone had thought to bring coffee. She put her hand out to the dog, and he moved into it without hesitation, as he always did, as he always would, this dog who had been built for one life, and ended up in another who had learned, somehow, to accept both. She thought, that's the work, isn't it? Not forgetting, not moving on. That phrase had always sounded false to her, like leaving something behind. But something else, something closer to carrying it differently, learning the weight of it, getting your hands under it right, so you could still move. She thought of Joel in the building outside Petawawa, taking the far corner the way he always did, confident and capable and completely trusted by the dog at his heel. She thought, I'm sorry, I will always be sorry, but I am still here. Kodiak's tail moved once, slowly, against the floor. Outside, the lake held its winter silence, that enormous, particular quiet of a place where the wind had stopped and the snow had settled, and nothing was moving except the light shifting in the west and pale gold against white, the long, late afternoon light of a January day in the north, lasting longer now than it had a month ago, turning slowly, impossibly, toward spring.